Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Saturday, everybody. This week saw the 24th China-EU summit, where President of the European Council, Charles Michel, and President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, met with General Secretary Xi Jinping and other top leadership in Beijing for the first time in person in 4 years. Though not as adversarial as the US-China relationship, EU-China relations are also quite poor, with a growing hawkish attitude in Europe. Expectations going into the talks were low, and this appears to have been the correct attitude to have, as the outcomes from the meeting were modest and both sides appear to be sticking to their positions towards each other. As we will see from the PRC side, a common theme is so-called problems of perception from Western countries. In Xi's meeting, he, quote, urged the two sides to develop a right perception of each other, end quote, as if how others view China is solely tied to their subjective perceptions rather than in response to China's own actions. We did a deep dive into the EU-China relationship ahead of the summit earlier this week, so for today we just cover the salient updates, which should act as a supplement to that earlier episode. According to state media, Xi Jinping called on China and the European Union to be partners for mutually beneficial cooperation, and that the China-EU relationship has strategic significance and implications for global peace, stability and prosperity, adding, quote, we should not view each other as rivals just because our systems are different, reduce cooperation because competition exists, or engage in confrontation because there are disagreements, end quote. At a joint press conference following the summit, President von der Leyen made an official statement on the talks, which we will now quote selected excerpts from directly. This is quite a long quote, but it's important to cover as it provides a succinct articulation of many of the core issues the Europeans have with China. Von der Leyen started with trade, and I'm now quoting her directly. We trade 2.3 billion euros of goods every single day. This shows that our trade relationship with China is important, but we explained why we see our trade is critically imbalanced. Our trade deficit has reached almost 400 billion euros. 20 years ago, it was 10 times smaller, 40 billion euros. This is a matter of great concern for a lot of Europeans. Such imbalances are just unsustainable. The root causes are well known, and we discuss them. They range from a lack of market access for European companies to the Chinese market, to preferential treatment of domestic Chinese companies and overcapacities in the Chinese production. Politically, European leaders will not be able to tolerate that our industrial base is undermined by unfair competition. We like competition, but competition needs to be fair. Von der Leyen then turned to a theme which has caused great consternation in China, as regular viewers have seen. Of course, we also discussed the approach of de-risk, not decouple. China, by the way, has a long-standing similar approach. China called it self-reliance, and it was partially included in the dual circulation approach. I want to be very clear here too. Europe does not want to decouple from China. We have seen a decoupling of Europe from Russia, and for good reasons. We do not want a decoupling from China. What we want is de-risking. De-risking is about managing the risks we see, addressing excessive dependencies through diversification of our supply chains. So strengthening our supply chains, have a more robust supply chain from several suppliers, and thus increasing our resilience. And this is not exclusive to China. It is about learning the lessons from both the global COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's energy blackmail. In light of increasing geopolitical frictions, it is important for us to strengthen and diversify our supply chains. As an aside, President Michel in his comments suggested that China's export restrictions on critical materials proved the need for such policies, expressing at the same press conference, quote, graphite is fundamental for the defense industry. China has decided to limit the export of graphite, and this has consequences for our sovereignty and strategic autonomy. This example shows what's at stake for the EU. We must better protect our interests. End quote. Then von der Leyen continued, bringing up other matters of concern, digital topics in general and artificial intelligence specifically, climate change and environmental concerns, as well as the carbon markets. Finally, von der Leyen turned to the two big geopolitical themes: Ukraine and Taiwan. We quote her once again. Russia's war of aggression is a blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter, and it is a serious threat to European security. That is why we recalled the need for China to use all its influence on Russia to stop this war of aggression and to engage in Ukraine's peace formula. Lastly, we expressed our concerns to China about tensions in the region, particularly in the Strait of Taiwan. Heightened instability in the East and South China Seas put at risk global prosperity and regional security. We stand strongly against any kind of unilateral change of the status quo of Taiwan, in particular by the use of force. Here ends the direct quote. US-based Politico reports that the Europeans warned Xi Jinping to immediately deal with a list of companies involved in supplying Russia with dual-use goods. Some 13 companies based in China are in the EU's sights as the bloc seeks to tighten up on leakages of dual-use goods being exported to Russia, which Kiev and its Western allies say are enabling the war of aggression against Ukraine. Quote, absent adequate assurances from Beijing, EU leaders meeting in Brussels next week may decide to name and shame the companies. End quote. The official Chinese readout didn't touch on this demand. Michel told reporters after the summit talks, quote, we sincerely hope that the appropriate action will be undertaken by the Chinese. End quote. David Rennie, Beijing bureau chief for UK-based The Economist, writes this week that China and the EU risk a trade war, expressing in a special piece on the topic, the EU visitors were expected to raise Chinese closeness to Russia and to ask about alleged sales by Chinese companies of dual-use items, such as semiconductors or drone parts, that help Russia's war effort in Ukraine. Alas, China's line on Ukraine has hardened in recent months. Chinese officials have left Western diplomats with the impression that they expect Vladimir Putin to avoid a humiliating defeat and to see Western unity crumble, making a frozen conflict a likely outcome. Just in case China's indifference to moral pressure was not clear enough, on December 4th, Mr. Xi hosted Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, for the second time this year. Mr. Xi spoke of strengthening political trust with the Belarusian leader, a Putin ally and pariah in EU circles. China, for its part, continues to invest heavily in manufacturing. Chinese officials appear to believe that their country's market power and control of clean technologies will force Europe to back down. They hope that Ms. von der Leyen's commission lacks support from key EU governments. Perhaps they are right. If they are wrong, this could end with a trade war. Here ends the quote from the Economist article. Meanwhile, chairperson of the National People's Congress Foreign Affairs Committee, Fu Ying, who also served as China's ambassador to the Philippines, Australia and the United Kingdom, as well as Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, is known as an effective communicator of Beijing's positions to an international, especially an Anglophone audience. This week, in a piece called China, EU Need to Prioritize Cooperation in Relations, Fu attempts to persuade a European audience to Beijing's outlook, pushing old themes, though not as clumsily as other senior officials have in recent months. Quote, Europe has a close relationship with the United States, but it would not want to see the world divided by power rivalry. Therefore, Europe can play the role of being a strategic counterweight to the multipolar trend emerging in the world rather than contribute to the fragmentation of the world. As President Emmanuel Macron of France said, EU member states should avoid becoming vassals, and that the bloc could function as a third pole in geopolitics alongside the US and China. Indeed, when the world moves towards multipolarity, it's very important that countries like China and France, as well as other European countries, have profound discussions on the prospect. The human world is yet to experience peaceful multipolar governance. We need to explore theoretically and practically how to deal with common international challenges in the future so as to build a community of shared future for mankind that can accommodate the interests of all parties. End quote. Again, we can see that Fu has much more intellectual and rhetorical dexterity than some of her senior peers in the government, Yet once again, however, Beijing seems unable or unwilling to recognize that some of the EU's most fundamental issues with it, namely the massive trade deficit and the Russian war in Ukraine, are primarily driven by local European concerns, not US pressure. Next up, we move to the economy. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying your Saturday and I hope you're getting some value from today's episode. If you are, I have a big favor to ask. 45% of regular viewers are not subscribed to China Update. If you're one of those regular viewers and you'd like to see this channel keep going and keep growing, the biggest way you can help is subscribing, hitting the bell notification icon, and liking this video. It just takes a couple of clicks, but it makes a huge difference for the channel. This is one of the best ways, the primary way in which the channel can grow and be shown to new people on YouTube. It's a massive help, and if you like the channel, I very much appreciate this assistance. And for those who want to help keep China Update financially sustainable, allow me to continue making these open and free for all 6 and probably this week 7 days. There'll be an extra episode tomorrow a week. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, the troubling state of overseas investment in China. According to preliminary data published by the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, SAFE, last month, net foreign direct investment, FDI, into the Chinese mainland in the third quarter continued its steep slide, recording its first negative reading since the key economic measure began being compiled 25 years ago. The gauge fell to negative $11.8 billion in the July through September period. Meanwhile, FDI data released by the Ministry of Commerce, a different gauge for overseas investment in China, showed that total FDI plunged 9.4% year-on-year to just shy of 1 billion yuan, $138 billion during the first 10 months of this year. Other gauges demonstrate similar trends. A recent UBS report showed that in August, China assets accounted for 3.1% of the portfolios of the almost 900 long-only foreign funds followed by the bank, down from 6.5% in January 2021, a reduction of over 50%. More than a third of the funds had sold all of their China holdings. The US-based Wall Street Journal reports this week that the amount of money that institutional investors have in Chinese stocks and bonds has declined by more than $31 billion this year through October, the biggest net outflow since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Quote, hedge funds, including Dalio's Bridgewater Associates, have significantly reduced their holdings of Chinese securities. Private equity firms have slashed fundraising targets for their Asia funds or stopped raising China-oriented funds altogether. Mutual fund managers, such as Vanguard, have either pulled out or aborted their China plans. Over the past decade, private equity funds targeting China have raised an average of nearly $100 billion each year. So far this year, they have raised a meager $4.35 billion. End quote. For years, US companies have been wary of the risks of doing business in China, the outlet argues. Wall Street, however, saw huge profit potential and went in. Quote, the retreat now by the sector that became one of Beijing's most trusted cheerleaders in the US is more evidence that China's decades-long boom is ending. End quote. Now, a strong argument can be made that these capital outflows were simply driven by a weak yuan and better yields in other markets, and thus is a relatively short-term phenomenon. While this may be in part true, it wouldn't explain what we are seeing with businesses on the ground, which point to a longer-term trend. According to the recently published 2023 China Business Report from the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, 40% of the 325 respondents to its survey were redirecting or planning to move out investment originally planned for China, up 6 percentage points versus 2022, with Southeast Asia the main destination for this redirected capital. We remember that the respondents' confidence in their 5-year business outlook in China sank to the lowest point in the survey's 25-year history, with only 52% expressing optimism. The Chamber report makes it clear what is fueling the sentiment in China-based corporate America. Quote, among companies reporting plans to curb investment, 70% blamed uncertainty about US-China tensions, 49% cited slowing growth in China, and 48% expressed concern over future Chinese commercial policies. End quote. There are other trends underway too. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin writes this week that some see the reallocation of manufacturing supply chains from China to other countries as an inevitable trend. Quote, in recent years, governments in several nations, including the US, Japan, South Korea, and some in Europe, have encouraged their companies to shift manufacturing production away from China, either to their home country or to other regions, such as Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the China-US trade war has led some manufacturers to shift capacity from China to avoid additional US tariffs. End quote. One Asia-Pacific chief economist at S&P Global Ratings Inc. reportedly expressed to the outlet, quote, these recent developments are on top of a longer-running shift of manufacturing capacity from China to other countries by some firms because of rising costs in China. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. It's highly likely there will be an extra special episode tomorrow. Thank you everybody for watching today's episode, and I will see you all on Sunday.